Okay, our next Gilbreth lecturer is Dr. Kat Knauer. She's an assistant professor and fellow in the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering at the University of Colorado. She is also a researcher at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. As a polymer scientist, she is dedicated to addressing the pressing issue of plastic waste. She earned her doctorate in polymer science and engineering from the University of Southern Mississippi. Kat will give us an overview of AI-driven plastic redesign for recyclable materials. Please join me in welcoming Kat to the stage.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am very excited to be here and incredibly honored to speak alongside Jesse and Jiwen today as Gilbreth lecturers. It's not every day that people think work in plastics is very sexy, and so I was really excited that I generated enough interest in my work to be invited here today and to tell you guys about how important it is that we address the plastic waste problem. So as Sujay mentioned, I have a joint appointment between the University of Colorado-Boulder in chemical and biological engineering, and then also at what was formerly known as the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. This has been renamed the National Laboratory of the Rockies. But regardless, we're still hyper-focused on how we can address our country's biggest energy and emissions challenges and how materials that are less energy intensive and less polluting to our world. And for me, I focus in the plastic waste space for that exact reason. So today I'm going to be talking about how we can use AI beyond the current kind of tech industry that we typically associate it with. And we can use AI and machine learning to also help us redesign materials and plastics to be more intrinsically recyclable and help us mitigate this dramatic waste crisis that we're currently dealing with. So as I set the framework for my research and what I have focused my life doing, I do want to talk about plastics. So how many of you have walked on a trail or walked on the beach, a place where you shouldn't ever see plastic, and you find pieces of plastic all over the ground? Yeah, unfortunately, this is a part of our everyday lives. We have an inordinate amount of plastic waste entering into our natural ecosystems every single day. So this is a photo of where I grew up. I'm from Florida originally. I grew up in South Florida. And Miami Beach used to be, it's quite affluent place, and I used to never see plastic waste on the beach until the last 5 to 6 years, where we started getting enormous amounts of sargassum, which in and of itself is a result of climate change. But within that, this plastic waste that's bringing it onto the shore. So a lot of ocean plastic waste with more developing parts of our world, especially in the global south. But it's not just there. We're now seeing waste affect all of our communities, and it's time that we wake up and acknowledge it, because this is carbon-dense material that we're losing to the natural environment. Essentially, plastic waste is one huge oil spill across the globe. And we see oil as being this incredibly valuable commodity. And so why can't we look at plastic the same way and get that material back to run our chemical processes and make new plastics again? And I also want to address a very important note here, that when we think of plastics, we often think of the problem of this very visible pollution. We think about the straw up the turtle's nose and plastics in the ocean. But it's more than that. Plastics are also a climate challenge. So when we think about the way we use, produce, and then dispose of plastics, it creates more greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis than, sorry, Jesse, to one-up you on your talk, but more than the entire aviation sector. So when we think about climate change and getting to our emission reduction goals, plastic waste is actually a huge, massive contributor to that, more than flying our airplanes. So this is another reason why places like the Department of Energy, RPE, and many of my funding sources care about this, because it's more than just cleaning up the physical pollution, it's cleaning up our air. I also have a question I do want to pose to you students. What are the 3 greenhouse gases? Can anyone tell me? Fossil fuels are where some of these come from, the combustion of fossil fuels, but there's 3 greenhouse gases. CO2, methane, water. The worst one, Nitrous oxide. Yes, whoever said nitrous oxide, you got it. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with. And this is why recycling is incredibly important. Because our vision is essentially if we can make recycling work, not only would we clean up our planet and get that plastic out of our ocean, but we would also start creating or getting closer and closer to our emission reduction goals. So what I'm showing here is a really beautiful study that actually came out of ETH Zurich a few years ago, which showed the world for the first time that we can get to a net zero emissions economy for plastics, which we didn't think was possible before unless we stopped making plastics, which is not going to happen. We needed a new solution for that. What this study essentially showed is that there's two things that have to happen together to get to net zero emissions for plastic waste. One is we have to get our recycling rates up to 70%. Does anyone know what our recycling rates are currently at? Got a lot of number, but globally we're 9% of a recycling rate. So nowhere near 70% yet, but there's another second component here that has to happen concurrently with that goal. And it's we have to start diverting our feedstocks into utilization of biomass and biogenic carbon to really and truly reach this goal. I'm not saying we're going to stop using fossil fuels for everything. They have a place, of course, but when we think about the planetary boundaries of plastic production and how far out of it we currently are, we can no longer sustain it with fossil fuels without detrimental repercussions in all of your futures, which is something to keep in mind. And so this is the goal of my research team, is we are trying to figure out how do we create more plastics that are inherently bio-based, but how do we also make sure they are intrinsically recyclable and they can make it into a recycling waste stream, be recycled very easily, and also generate an economic value and profit at the end of the day. Because this endeavor will never be philanthropic. It will always have to be driven by economics, and we have to show value in plastics. So this is what motivates our team in the research that we do. And so at the end of the day, my degrees are chemical engineering, but really I'm a polymer chemist. I do a lot of reactor design, but I also design polymers. So polymers are plastics. They are the macromolecules that make up plastics, the inherent building blocks of those. And so when we think about redesigning polymer chemistry for the future to align with these climate goals, circularity goals, sustainability goals, we have to create a very important balance. This is the balance that our team is trying to emulate within our research. So when we design a new material for the future, our first goal is always recyclability. How do we make it so this material can be recycled in an infinite life cycle without detrimental loss in its material performance? It is quite a daunting challenge, but it's one that we focus on because one, that's how we're going to get to those goals I mentioned before. And two, if we make this process easier, then by extension, we ideally would make it more economical and profitable to recycle. So when I talk about recycling here, I'm actually talking about taking plastic and converting it back into its inherent chemical building block for subsequent reuse. That's kind of difficult to do right now because we never made plastics to break down. That wasn't the point in the 1950s when we discovered this amazing material. It was incredible that it lasted forever. Now we're in that world where we have to learn from those mistakes, and how do we make something that performs just as well, has all the benefits of plastics, but when we're done using it, we can unzip it right back to that chemical building block again, so it can be purified and reused in a chemical factory to make a plastic again. So that's goal number one. We also have to learn from the mistakes of the past, in that we generated an enormous amount of plastic with no waste management in mind for it. And now, unfortunately, we've mismanaged a lot of that plastic and it's entered our natural environment. So how do we also ensure a backup plan of biodegradation? And I'm not talking about creating readily biodegradable plastic that you put into your garden at home. I'm talking about how do we make a backup plan for if that material is littered, which it shouldn't be, but it's going to happen. If it's littered, can it break down naturally into benign components within 5 years, rather than 450 years of our current materials? And so I don't mean to belabor this so much, but I do think it's important for you all, as you maybe aspire to be material scientists, this is our responsibility to society. Innovations and technological progress, from my perspective, needs to go hand in hand with minimizing environmental impact. And so this is an important balance that we emulate in our team. So considering this balance, we turned to a type of chemistry called polyesters. So polyester, when you think of it, you probably think of what you're wearing in your clothes, polyester fibers, which is a huge part of polyester chemistry, but there's lots of different types of polyesters out there. And the reason we like polyesters and we like this ester bond that I'm showing here is because, one, ester bonds are much, much easier to break down chemically than carbon-carbon bonds. Most of the plastic you use today are nothing but carbon-carbon bonds in an infinite macromolecular length. And it's so hard to break those bonds. Ester bonds will break much easier when you want them to. When we think about that goal of depolymerization or the recycling I mentioned before, they're much easier at that. Two, there's a lot of naturally occurring enzymes and microbes that like to digest ester bonds and do so safely and naturally. So when we think about that long-term backup plan that I mentioned, not all polyesters, but some polyesters can break down into benign products within soil, freshwater, marine water, and biota. And then finally, there's so many different types of polyesters we can make, infinite amount of chemical combinations that we can do to get to really specific properties. So as polymer chemists, we have a whole playground of chemistry to play in and fine-tune these to get into all the different performance metrics that we need for plastics today. So we've identified polyesters as a really target part of the chemistry our team is working on. And because there are thousands upon hundreds of thousands of combinations we can do to make polyesters, we're trying to work smarter here, and this is where we're using artificial intelligence and machine learning to enable us to do that. So my team developed a program called PolyID. So PolyID is an inverse design machine learning neural network that we built using the last 100 years of polymer science data. So what I'm showing over here to the left, these are basically some of the most common types of plastics you're gonna see in the typical municipal waste streams that you use every day. All these plastics have been around for a really long time. They're very, very good at what they do, but they've caused a lot of issues when it comes to recycling, as I mentioned before. So we've taken all the known structure property relationships of these incumbent materials, and again, decades of data that have been published on these polymers, and we have fed all of that in over the last 5 years to the PolyID neural network, which the idea is once you feed it enough data, it can start learning, active learning from it, and it can start generating new algorithms and new ways of predicting combinations of polymers that haven't been done before, but can use bio-based feedstocks to make them and can match the performance of these incumbent materials. So we use that machine learning network to essentially try to predict various types of polyester backbones that we know we could synthesize and then compare to the incumbent materials that are in plastics now. And ideally, we're trying to create a less complicated waste stream, a more monomaterial type for plastics. So again, we can create more profitability around recycling. So this is what my team essentially does, is we use PolyID to predict structures, we synthesize them, we test them, and then we feed the results back into that neural network again. It sounds kind of boring, but that's what AI is all the time. So that's what ChatGPT is doing with you guys. You type in your thoughts and feelings, and it learns about you, and then it creates a new algorithm for you. But anyways, it's a concept here. And so this is what an output looks like from PolyID, if you're curious. And so what it does is it essentially plots various types of properties versus each other. And each of these data points on these scatter plots represents the combination of two molecules that, if they are reacted together in an infinite macromolecular chain, they will exhibit property A, B, C, hypothetically. And so what we can do using these plots is we can go in and we can start looking at all these chemistries to find out what is doable from an economic point of view, and also can we derive those molecules from biomass and biological feedstocks. So again, this reduces the amount of research iteration time for us significantly, and it helps us generate new material much, much quicker than what we had to do before, which was based on kind of intuition and chemistry design. But this is what the output looks like. And in this particular case study, we're thinking a lot about the barrier performance of that polymer. Can anyone tell me why barrier would be a really important metric for food packaging? What do you think food packaging is preventing from getting inside? Contaminants. What makes food go bad? Bacteria, air. Air is very important. And then what's the other one? Water, exactly. So air and water are what make our food essentially go bad. And so when we think about plastic packaging, you need a polymer film that has very robust barrier layer against those two components. Polyesters are notoriously bad at that. And so whenever I talk to plastic producers about using polyesters, they usually shut me down because they don't have a track record of having high barrier. But poly-ID is allowing us to find chemistries that could break through that glass ceiling and could actually show the world that depending on the microstructure, you could still get a polyester with a very high barrier against moisture and water. And so that's why we're looking at the permeation of water and air in that upper left hand graph, because that's very important for us. And so I want to show you guys a few case studies of materials that we've designed that have actually worked out really well based on using this machine learning framework. So this is a polymer that we call PHPD for short. We were trying to design something to replace polyethylene. So polyethylene is basically the baggy material, like this type of little bag, Ziploc bags, grocery bags, dry cleaning bags, pallet wrap, a lot of other applications as well. It's the most highest volume used plastic in the world. So we wanted to see if we could find a replacement for polyethylene that behaved exactly like it, could eventually break down in the natural environment if it's littered, and could be recycled. So not an easy task to do, but we were quite successful in this project. This was actually a collaboration with Amazon when we were looking for an alternative material to their blue and white mailers, which are currently polyethylene mailers. So what we found is this really interesting macrolactone structure. So macrolactones are produced biologically. They're in plant extracts, they're in biomass, they're in our natural environment. This actual structure we found because one of my grad students at the time said he liked it because it smelled good. And this particular molecule is the molecule they use in cologne for musk. So there you go. But it turns out if you take musk and you ring open, polymerize it, it makes a beautiful aliphatic polyester that looks and behaves almost identical to polyethylene. And what was really cool about this material is with just a very, very simple alcohol, we can fully depolymerize it back into the macrolactone and very, very easily recover that building block for recycling purposes. It also will fully break down in composting conditions within 80 days, fresh water within 300 days, and marine water within 2 years, which is a significant improvement compared to polyethylene, whose half-life in our environment, as I mentioned before, is on the order of 150 years. So these were all big wins, and so we scaled this up, and we actually ran a blown film trial, and what that means is essentially you're processing it the same way we would process an Amazon mailer package. And we compared the two side by side, and the material outperformed polyethylene. So this was a big win that we're continuing to work with companies like Amazon and others to scale this up and get this into our supply chains. And if you come to my poster, I brought samples of it so you can smell it because it smells good. And you can feel it and compare it to polyethylene, which is pretty cool. So this is one case study. Another polymer that we really like in the polyester family are called PHAs. These are polyhydroxyalkanoates. So PHAs are synthesized naturally by bacteria. So within a fermentation broth, a bacteria will use a carbon source like sugars, and it will synthesize a PHA polyester, and it will grow these like plastic granules on the surface that actually look exactly like this. So this is what a PHA biological production looks like. We really like PHAs because they're very biocompatible, and then if you can harness these and process them into plastics, they're highly biodegradable within less than 80 days in a particular case. And then if you compare it to all these other types of bioplastics that are on the market today, this is PHB, which is just an analog of PHA. They use them interchangeably. But PHB broke down in every single biological environment that was tested to the same rate that cellulose and starch do, which are other naturally occurring biopolymers. So people were like, oh my gosh, PHAs, that's the answer. They're going to be great. They're so good for the environment. The problem with PHAs is that biology doesn't make polymers that are meant to be melt processed into the products we use. Natural polymers don't like to be melted down and formed into things. It's really, really difficult for them to withstand those types of high temperature and energy conditions. And so this is how PHAs are made biologically. We take some type of biological feedstock that's lignin cellulosic rich or sugar rich. We feed that into a process that converts it into the sugars that are then put into a biofermentation reactor. Those sugars are harnessed, we make PHAs, we process products, and then we can put it into either recycling, composting, and unfortunately sometimes landfill. But biology can only make one kind of PHA. That's basically it. We don't have any control over the microstructure, over the tacticity, the molecular weight, all these things that are so critically important to the precise design of polymeric materials. But what's really cool about PHAs is they do have this chiral center that is very, very easily manipulated if you synthesize them chemocatalytically yourself. So our team was motivated to be inspired by nature, but instead of relying on bacteria to do this, can we mimic that backbone, that highly biocompatible backbone, and can we make these PHAs ourselves? So this is the way we make PHAs in our lab, is what we call chemocatalytically. So we've engineered a process to use feedstocks that are available today, both sugar-based, so biogenic feedstocks, or petroleum-based, which does offer some flexibility in the supply chain. So using both types of feedstocks, we can generate monomers, synthesize these polymers, and what this allows us to do as polymer chemists at the end of the day is tailor in that precise rubric that nature can't quite do, but we can, so we can control the processability of these materials. And rather than getting only one kind of stereostructure and molecular weight, we can generate a whole portfolio of polymers that look identically similar, but we've engineered them to be very, very precise materials, to behave like a laundry detergent bottle, to behave like a Ziploc bag, to behave like the fibers in our clothing. And so now we have all of this flexibility to test PHAs in a lot of different types of environments, and also have a way to reliably and repeatably make them. And so our team collaborated with the North Face recently, who wanted a new bio-based polyester fiber for their outdoor gear. Another reason North Face wanted this is because microplastic pollution, nearly 50% of all microplastics in the natural environment come from washing your clothes. So this is something we also don't think about, but you wear plastics on your body. The same plastic that is in this water bottle is the same polyester that is used to make your clothing. And whenever we wash our clothes, we shed fibers, which go into the ocean and waterways, and those are highly persistent. And microfibers are now shown to be tied to detrimental health effects in both marine life as well as in humans with recent studies. So can we create an alternative that is just as robust, because North Face needs something that's gonna last a long time and could do really well in harsh environments, but can we make it again so it's not so persistent? So we found we could, oh, I'm sorry this is so blurry, but essentially we found on that same chiral center that I mentioned before, we can apply a gem dimethyl substitution, and adding these two methyl bonds here actually makes this material highly crystalline and very melt processable, which is what we need for a fiber in our clothing. And so we worked on the development of this polymer for several years, started making really beautiful fibers from this. And then recently we did our very, very first scale-up effort where we processed this into a fiber, an actual processing line, the kilogram scale, showing the world's first 100% PHA fiber. So I have a little video, it's just 30 seconds long, but I'm gonna play it. So that's our polymer. That's how beautiful it is. So it's very cool. I know it's just like, what's the big deal? It's just a fiber. But no one has ever been able to get a bioplastic into a crystalline fiber form like this before. You know, obviously we use cotton in our clothing too, which is cellulose, but on the polyester world, it was a huge deal to do this on a processing line. So we continue to work with North Face to actually weave this into membranes, put this in conditions, get it in our Olympic athletes that are out there in Italy, and actually see if this material will hold up. So that's kind of the next steps there. But at the end of the day, we're making these polyesters, we're trying to make something more sustainable, but sometimes people ask me, are we just complicating the waste stream even more by introducing new materials, which is a completely valid question to ask. And so we have to think about end of life and what are the best options for the processing and recycling of these polyesters as we design them. So we use a tool called life cycle assessment heavily in our lab. So life cycle assessment is when you evaluate the overall environmental impact of a new material or new chemical production or whatever type of process you're developing. And you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, but you also look at water consumption, eutrophication, toxicity, ozone depletion, all the environmental metrics that can potentially be detrimental. So we did a life cycle assessment looking at end-of-life options for these polyesters, and we found that it kind of goes in a worst case scenario all the way to best case scenario, and it kind of follows the same logic I've been using for this entire talk. Worst case scenario is, it goes into landfill because PHAs, for example, in a landfill aerobic environment, when there's anaerobic environment, they break down and create methane, which is not good because that's one of the greenhouse gas emissions. So we don't want them going into a landfill. If they end up into soil degradation, this is not a bad thing because they are not persistent, but they will create biogenic carbon dioxide emissions, and it's bad. We don't want to ever be putting plastics in the environment. Doesn't matter if they biodegrade, it's not what we want to do. So it's not a good decision. Composting is great, but most places in the world don't have access to large industrial composting facilities. And then we found from an LCA point of view or life cycle point of view, the most optimal condition here was recycling. So it kind of goes back to that study I mentioned before. Recycling is always the #1 goal. And so we set out to then engineer a recycling system for mixtures of polyesters. So this was the next big step in our team's endeavors is, could we ever have a recycling process that could use or take a mixture of plastics and break them down efficiently? Right now, all of our recycling is based on separations. Plastics come into a waste handling facility, and then they have to meticulously separate the plastics by their type, which is really difficult to do. It's a very dirty and disgusting job, and it also is not very efficient. So it's one of the things that have really limited recycling in many parts of our world. So we want to overcome that burden and create a robust polyester agnostic recycling platform that doesn't matter what type of plastic you put it in there, it gets recycled. And so we engineered this system here that we used techno-economic analysis and life cycle assessments to help us model first. And then based on our engineering models, we constructed the reactor and the downstream separations process. And so everything I'm showing here is essentially 4 years of work summarized in one diagram. But a postdoc in my group, Julia Curley, she discovered this amine catalyzed methanolysis process that just uses methanol to cleave those ester bonds. And then she's a really good engineer, so she figured out a whole downstream separation unit operations to recover each of those individual biogenic carbon building blocks back for subsequent reuse. And to summarize all of that, we were able to reconstruct plastics and show that they have the same performance of the first primary counterparts that went into the recycling, so we're not losing any performance. And then our economic analysis showed for this one model plant, it made about $29 million a year at scale. Many of you are probably going to look at that number and say, that's not very much. But for the recycling world, this is huge. This is a huge profit. So recyclers are excited about that data. And then also we have a nearly 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for the production of these plastics when making them through this recycling process rather than through their initial primary production, which was also significant since that's our goal. So we call this process ester cycle. Julia started a company and she spun this off of our lab. And so now we have a startup company based in Colorado where we're trying to scale up and we're trying to convince all the ski resorts and other things in Colorado to use these bio-based polyesters and do a pilot to show that they can be effectively recycled in a circular manner. So I want to summarize here by showing our vision and what we hope we're going to achieve. So this is the way we make plastics now. And I've mentioned this already before. It's very linear. We take fossil fuels out of the ground, we combust them into hydrocarbons, we make plastics, we use them most of the time once, and then we throw them away. And so we call this the take, make, waste economy. We want to transition to a circular economy where we don't have to rely on fossil fuels or even biogenic feedstocks anymore because we've kept those carbons in a circular loop. We use plastic as the feedstock to make materials again. And our recent life cycle assessment that we just published in One Earth, we actually showed that if our current plastic supply chain, if only 35% transitioned into a bioplastic, and then those were recycled by our ester cycle process at a rate of 70%, we could reduce the carbon dioxide emissions of plastic production by 500 million metric tons per year, which is really quite substantial. So this is our vision that we're trying to get to. We have a long way to go because this industry is conservative and incredibly resistant. And so we have a lot to fight against, but with data, with science, with economic numbers, and with life cycle assessment, we think we can slowly but surely convince the world that this type of future is possible. And so I do want to wrap up here, and I want to just leave you all with a little bit of hope in that it has been really remarkable in my career to see how much this has changed from when I was an undergrad to a grad student, writing NSF proposals about plastics that nobody cared about. And then in the last 5 years or so, there was a huge wake-up call to this, and it spurred all this support and funding, and I don't know how long that will last. I'm riding that wave while I can, but it's been really remarkable to see how much investment has been made into the space of cleaning up our planet. And I hope that gives you guys some hope, since you are the future, and really you guys are the ones that are going to be leading this charge at the end of the day. So I thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Kat, for a very enlightening talk. I think we have time for, let's try 2 questions. Please raise your hand. We can bring the microphone to you. And then during the reception and poster session, I'm sure Kat can answer further questions. And one over here. So one on each side. Let's go. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Iklali. I'm from Samueli Academy. And I wanted to ask how you see consumerism influencing the success of a true circular plastic economy.
That is such an excellent question, because consumers are unfortunately what break these systems the most. We are in a recycling kind of world where the onus is almost entirely on consumers to participate and do it correctly. And the problem with that is every single town, county, city, state, country in the world recycles totally differently. It's a patchwork quilt, and it makes no sense. You literally can drive from Irvine to Orange County or to San Clemente, and they'll be like, no, we don't take that in our recycling system. And so it's so difficult to know and understand as consumers, and a lot of burden falls on us to do it correctly. And so as we do create these new processes and we create new plastics, that will always be the biggest bottleneck. And so we have to think about not only the investment here in the science and engineering, but the grassroots investment, which is substantial. Education of consumers, door-to-door efforts. I mean, truly, these are the only ways we're gonna make this happen. And so this is another call to action to you young folks out there. It's up to you. Unfortunately, you still gotta do the legwork. You gotta do your research. You gotta see what goes in your recycling bin at home. You gotta tell your parents to wash out that yogurt container before they put it in the recycling bin. You have to be the annoying person. This is what I am. I yell at people all the time about recycling. So I need you guys to do this too, because it all starts at the household. Almost every part of this is driven by consumer participation. So it's a socioeconomic problem that now I have to also think about as a not socioeconomic person, but it's also one that's so critical to the success of these technologies. So we have to figure out how to expand our models to include consumer behavior and not just numbers, which is what we're used to as engineers. But that's the next endeavor, is how do we include the human aspect of these models as well.
All right, one more question over here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Adrian Gallegos, and I just wanted to ask, for example, in cutting boards that are plastic, and when you cut stuff on them, they leave a bunch of microplastics which can stay in the body, the brain. Is there any chance your product does something similar like that, or is it better than that?
Another excellent question. These ones are tough to answer because, of course, there's that part of me that's like, yes, ours is going to be better. But currently, we don't know. So that's another problem with developing new materials that you know are going to enter into the consumer world is sometimes the impacts and effects environmentally and in terms of human health aren't realized for 20 years. And so it's another challenge we have is trying to understand from past mistakes and extrapolating from them of what chemistries did we think were benign and safe that are now showing problematic features, and can we make sure we design around, not around that, but design that out of systems today. So ideally, because we're trying to use bio-based precursors and we're trying to make materials that are more biocompatible, the idea would be if this was a cutting board, it would be safer as it sheds a piece of microplastic that you inevitably eat. We don't know if that's the case yet because things can transform over time. And a big problem with plastics is also that the polymer in and of itself isn't necessarily the part that's detrimental in a microplastic. It's the additives that are used to formulate it and make it look and behave the way that cutting board looks and behaves. Those ones are more difficult to understand too. So it's a great question because that's what we have to do is long-term testing to understand how it impacts human health. But we don't know that yet.
Thank you.
Right. Please join me in
Thank
thanking
you.
Kat.